Hi there, so this video or PowerPoint is going to go through comparing the approaches, and this is for AQA Psychology Approaches section, paper 2. So we're just going to go through kind of the possible types of questions that come up and how you can compare the approaches. Now, I don't think myself, as a psychology teacher, that this is too difficult as long as you've covered most of the course. So if you've done paper 1 and all the topics in there, and paper 2, approaches, biopsychology and research methods, which you can use for your evaluation information, and then paper 3, the topics in there. Particularly if you've done issues and debates, but it's not essential at this point because obviously this is paper 2. But if you've done issues and debates and your teacher's talked about it, you'll be able to link that in as well. And obviously by the end of the course, you will have covered issues and debates, so you'll be in a better place when you sit your exams. Okay, so we're going to go through obviously when you're making notes and watching this video, I want you to go through and obviously know your different approaches. So if you don't know them, I've put them on here. Pause the video and just give yourself 2 or 3 key facts about each approach. You should be able to say to yourself the behaviourist approach, Pavlov, Skinner, operant conditioning, classical conditioning, reactive learning from the environment, ignores internal mental processes, non-biological, reductionist. So all of those things, you should be able to do that for each of those approaches. Okay, if you don't, go back over the approaches. Okay, you definitely need to be able to do that for your approaches section, but also to be able to compare the approaches. Then you've got social learning theory. Sometimes behaviourist and social learning, they are linked together and they're called the learning approaches. So you could get a question asking you to compare the learning approaches with the biological approach. In that, you could not do the behaviourist approach, you could just do social learning theory. I would say still do the behaviourist approach, but if your mind goes blank and you just did social learning theory, if it said learning approaches, then you can just refer to one of them. But again, if it says learning approaches, ideally use both of them. But if your mind goes blank, then you're okay with one of them. But be aware that if it says learning approaches, that is what it's referring to, behaviourist and social learning theory. You've then got cognitive approach, so likening the mind to a computer, input, throughput, output, the concept of schemas, modern day cognitive neuroscience, brain scans, and how we can scan the brain, see different areas that are working, and then attribute those behaviours to those different areas of the brain. So that's really the cognitive approach. I know a lot of my students didn't like it at the start when we first went through the approaches, but the more you've studied psychology, the more you keep coming back into the cognitive approach. CBT as one of the treatments in the psychopathology topic, eyewitness testimony in memory, a lot of the memory multi-store model, you can use that in the cognitive approach. Working memory model as an alternative developed version of the multi-store model, you can use those, link them to input, throughput, output for the cognitive approach. The biological approach, again, you'll have learnt it maybe at the start of your course or early on in your course, and then you've learnt more as you've done biopsychology. Key things are coming from evolution, adapting to our environment, link that back into psychology. So things like smartphones, we've adapted. There's evidence to show our short-term memory is getting less because we have our smartphones, we rely on them for our knowledge and technology. Relationships, because obviously it's survival of the fittest, passing on our genes, so just thinking about those factors. Phenotype, genotype, scientific approach. Then you've got psychodynamic approach, Freud, unconscious mind, all of those things. Try and bear in mind, especially for comparison, that Freud was originally a doctor, so he was scientific, but obviously he kind of stemmed away from that, had the unconscious mind, and kind of lost his mind a little bit, but was criticised for that. And then humanistic approach actively rejects science. So again, all of the approaches, think about them, how scientific are they, and then you can compare them on those different factors. Nature, nurture, they're the issues and debates, but it really doesn't matter because you will be familiar with these as you've gone through. So your humanistic approach is very much looking at the whole person, holistic approach, actively rejecting science, the different types of counselling, trying to think what else, the congruence, so the benefits to people. So you've got counselling in there, so you can then compare that to the psychodynamic approach because that's got psychotherapy, and also the cognitive approach and the effectiveness of CBT. So there's loads of different things that I've already just kind of thought off the top of my head that I could compare my approaches to, because it's likely the two types of questions that you'll get for compare the approaches is it might say describe the behaviourist approach or describe learning approach, and then compare it to one other approach, and then you can pick which one you want. Pick a really strong contrasting one. Or it might state outline learning approach, compare it to biological approach, and then you've got to know it. So you need to go in knowing all of the different options. Okay, so here we're just referring to the issues and debates. So we look at the approaches or look at a number of key factors from issues and debates, which I've kind of referred to already. So as we study Unit 3, so the last paper, you'll learn about the issues and debates and look at the types of questions that you might get asked. But in order to compare the approaches, it will help to know the terminology. So you may have covered this, depending on the order that you've been taught it. All of you, when you've got to comparing the approaches, certainly with my students, will have referred to issues and debates as we've been going through reductionism, nature, nurture, ideographic, nomothetic. So a number of terminologies we will have referred to that you can use in your essays. Okay, so this is one of our issues and debates, so free will and determinism. I'm just going to go through this as a kind of an introduction or a recap for you. You can obviously pause it at any time, and again, a lot of this will be covered when you go through the issues and debates topic. So you can use these terms in your comparing the approaches, but don't stress about it if you haven't covered this, because you'll look at this in more detail in the issues and debates. Okay, so determinism proposes that all behaviour has an internal or external cause, is therefore predictable. So determinism, you've got different types of determinism, and if you think about it, you will know what the term free will means. Free will is choice, complete choice over everything. You choose to get out of bed in the morning, choose what to eat for lunch, choose where you go in the day. Okay, so determinism is the opposite of that, that everything is predetermined. So that's where you then bring in the approaches. So if you think about the biological approach, that's deterministic because it's saying that we're pre-programmed, or it's predetermined by our genes, by whether we've got a gene for schizophrenia or crime or depression. Whereas the behaviourist approach is also deterministic, but it's about our upbringing, so it's in a different way. So that's really how you would compare it and bring those points in. Now, I would say that for a compare essay, you would use this as like a kind of a second part of your AO3. And bring those points in, and we'll come into that. So you do have different types of determinism, and again, then the words, note them down, but they link to the definitions of the approaches. So genetic determinism is obviously genes. So things are, so if you said about the biological approach is predetermined, and that's because of our genes. So you may have a gene, there is a suggestion there is a gene for or combination of genes for schizophrenia, and this is known as genetic determinism. However, in contrast, I like to compare it to the biological approach, the behaviourist approach, because it's very much the opposite, because it's still deterministic, but in terms of the environment, and you would say that that's environmental determinism. Psychic determinism again links to the psychodynamic approach, and they are both considered hard deterministic. So the psychodynamic approach is deterministic because it's governed by our upbringing, and the experiences we have as a child get repressed into the unconscious mind, and we can't control that. So therefore it's kind of in us, and we have to try and resolve those unconscious desires, but that is a very difficult process. Then the nice one, the cognitive approach, is considered a softer determinism, because you can choose whether you go through CBT, whether you engage in it, and you can come through it and have an outcome. So then you've got social learning theory, believes we have reciprocal determinism, the idea that as well as being influenced by our environment, we have some control over it. So we choose whether to imitate a role model or not, or a person that we look up to. So we can see that, observe our brother doing something and becoming respected, but actually we don't want to be a criminal and risk going to prison, so we choose not to do that. And then always remember this one, the humanistic approach always states that we have free will, and they always state that. So like they reject science, it says that we've got free will and we operate as active agents who determine our own development. Okay, so just worth considering those points, and you could link those in to your essay. So at the end of this section, we're going to have a table which you can download and complete, and that will give you a chance to bring all those points together. So I've got some compare the approaches questions here. So again, I'll have a little look at a couple of them. Might be worth just taking a screenshot of these and just going through and just having a go at them. So I think, again, when you look at them, you'll think this is all right, this isn't too difficult. So explain one way in which social learning theory overlaps with one other approach in psychology. So it's 2 marks. Social learning theory, comparing it with one other approach in psychology. So you want similarities in that one. So I would probably say the social learning theory, because it's come out of behaviorism. You could say that it's similar to the behaviorist approach conducted in a lab, or then you could do that with the cognitive. You could compare it, because just being wary there that the learning theory and behaviorist approach are both learning theories. I think you'd get away with that. But if you want to if you had a question like that and you were unsure, just go as different as possible, because then you can say, you know, that there is that similarity, that the social learning theory, Bandura's Bobo dolls, carried out in a lab, cognitive psychology, multi-store model, Miller's magic number 7, carried out in a lab. So they're similar in that they're both laboratory studies, but very different. Outline key features of the cognitive approach in psychology, compared the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. So I've got a plan for that, so we'll come on to that. The humanistic approach has little to offer psychology. Outline and evaluate the humanistic approach in psychology. Refer to at least one. So again, if you look at that question, it's giving you some clues about the humanistic approach, and then it's outline and evaluate. So you're just doing your description and then evaluation of the approach, just a standard essay, and then you need to just make sure you link to one other approach. So I'd go biological, but you would anyway, even if you'd missed out that question, you would probably compare it to another approach to bulk out that essay. So obviously you describe it, evaluate it, and then compare it to, say, biological approach. Again, outline and evaluate the social learning theory. In your answer, make comparisons with at least one other. So again, it's a nice description, evaluate of social learning theory, and then you're comparing it to one other approach. Now that one, I would say you could definitely compare it to behaviorism, all the usual stuff carried out in a lab, Bandura versus Pavlov, Skinner, all of those sorts of things, and then you can do similarities and differences there as well. And then you've got another 16 mark here as well. Why are there so many approaches in psychology? Teacher wrote, because each one has something different to offer to our understanding of the human mind. This makes every approach unique. Discuss what makes the psychodynamic unique in psychology, and then refer to other approaches. So here you need to make sure you've referred to the psychodynamic approach. What makes it unique? Good question. Refer to other approaches in your answer. So I guess it's the first approach that considered like stage theories of child development. So you could refer to that. First theory that looked at the unconscious mind or explanations for mental health. So you could talk about that, and then you could link it into where we are today with cognitive behavioural therapy and how we really understand the human mind. But also some of that research does link back to what Freud did in the early days of the psychodynamic approach. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of how you would conduct an essay. Now I've done a little plan here, so outline key features of the cognitive approach, excuse my line there, compare it with the psychodynamic approach. So you do the usual things here, you're outlining, break down your question, as I've done here really badly, but I've underlined the key words and want to make sure I've outlined the key features of the cognitive approach. Then I'd write a plan. I'd be like, key features of cognitive approach. And then my second part is comparing it with the psychodynamic approach. So make sure you read your essay, your question, because you don't want to just compare it with one other approach. It has to be the psychodynamic approach. So you start off by explaining the cognitive approach. Your mind is like a computer, the inclusion of schema, how we learn through schemas, little packages, input, throughput and output. And today the focus is cognitive neuroscience. And again, you can link back to the taxi drivers study, our understanding of ADHD, autism has all come through cognitive neuroscience. Through our understanding of dyslexia, working memory model is linked into dyslexia. It's referred to if you get a dyslexia report. Your working memory is referred to. That is where we're at with the cognitive approach. So it's still in existence. It's still important. It's still relevant. And that's your outline, the key features. As I say, this is your AO1. Now, it's doesn't say outline and evaluate. It goes straight on to compare the cognitive approach with the psychodynamic approach. Personally, if I was sitting this exam, I would feel uncomfortable not evaluating the approach at all. So I would go in with a little bit of an evaluation. So I'd talk about it being reductionist, too simplistic. There's modern day contributions through CBT and eyewitness testimony. So I'd do a paragraph just talking about the benefits and like the strengths and weaknesses of it. Show your knowledge, okay? Even if you don't get any marks, it would still sort of develop this, your outline. And then compare it to the psychodynamics. So they've both had contributions towards counselling and understanding the human mind. That's a big one, okay? They are quite different approaches. One is the cognitive approach is very scientific, psychodynamic approach is less so. And so, yeah, you've got to try and sort of pull those things together. So then I've just pulled together similarities and differences. Now, on the next slide is a table where you can look at all of the kind of linked approaches. So you can see which ones you need to make sure that you can link to. So that you would get that if you do this sort of task. So both understand the human mind. So you've got similarities and differences. Then you can put that into an essay. Both understand the human mind, offer therapies to try and make sense of consciousness. Both effective through talking therapies. If you can remember some stats in how effective they are from psychopathology or schizophrenia, then great, chuck them in there. And then they both link to memory, don't they? The cognitive approach through multi-store model, working memory, psychodynamic approach, repression is an explanation for memory. So you can link that in as well. Then you've got your differences. So the cognitive approach is scientific, psychodynamic isn't. If you can get it so that it's a similarity and then you link it together, so it's like a discussion point, that's how you get your discussion. That's how you get to the level 4. So although Freud originally came from a scientific perspective, every point here is showing my knowledge. It's not great. I've not linked to any research here, but it's showing my knowledge of these approaches. Okay, so they all would get me marks. They both explain memory, but Freud linked everything to the unconscious mind, and this cannot be observed, whereas the cognitive approach uses brain scans. So again, you've got a similarity. I was just checking that's not different. Yeah, so both explain, yeah, so they are sort of, I have put that one in as a similarity to begin with, but actually I then put it into a difference as well. And it doesn't matter if it's not clear cut, because it's a discussion is going backwards and forwards. So so yeah, that is your compare the approaches overview. Just a definition here on free will determinism. Determinism, the idea that our behaviour is determined by forces outside our control. Clearly some approaches are more deterministic than others. And then, yeah, this is the table which I'll upload for my students, and you can copy this down, and then you basically need to just go in and go, so along here you would have perhaps similarities. Just write this on really quickly. So that's your sims, that's your differences. I'll just put a minus as a plus, okay? Obviously you would write this better than this. So your similarities between the cognitive and the psychodynamic, they both refer to they both give explanations or treatments through counselling, so CBT, whereas psychodynamic is the psychotherapies. And then similarities between the cognitive and the biological approach, both scientific in their approach, and then say why. Cognitive and behaviourism, both scientific and use lab studies. Give an example. Cognitive, SLT, lab studies, give example. Humanistic, counselling. They both use counselling therapies. So then you've got a range of similarities between the cognitive and all of the approaches, and then you can do differences between the psychodynamic and the cognitive. So cognitive, scientific, psychodynamic isn't. Cognitive, biological differences. It's a tricky one. Cognitive is still looking at the mind, the mediational processes. Biological is very much looking at neurotransmitters and how they impact that. So if you think of them separately, I mean, obviously nowadays we know that they work together, so we use CBT and medication, and then you can then develop that as well into your essay. So I'm not going to go through this table with you. That's a 20-minute task that actually you will get so much out of by doing. So do it yourself. Best way of learning. Don't copy it from somewhere else. Okay, I think that is the end of my plan. The next bit is going on to issues and debates. I'm going to leave it there. But thank you for watching. If you're watching on YouTube, like, subscribe, and tell your friends. And yeah, see you soon.